Imagine stepping over piles of debris. And the only thing familiar being the concrete steps leading up to what was once Krabby Dad's Bar
Oh, wow.
in Steinhatchee, Florida. That's the reality for owner Scott Peters,
Yeah.
left to rebuild from scratch after Hurricane Helene. And it's a scene sadly playing out across Florida's Big Bend and up the coast as Helene, a Category 4 hurricane, left a trail of devastation. We're talking millions without power, confirmed fatalities, and entire communities forever changed. But today we want to go deeper than those headlines.
Absolutely. We often get caught up in the immediate numbers, but the real impact is in the human stories, the long-term effects, and unfortunately what feels like an all too familiar pattern emerging.
And that's exactly why we're here.
Yeah.
You've asked for a deep dive into Hurricane Helene's aftermath, and we've got firsthand accounts, news reports, and even some hurricane history from the University of Florida
Right.
to help us understand not just what happened, but what it means for the people and places in Helene's path.
And I think that's crucial because while Helene is a single event, it's part of a larger trend of increasingly intense storms and the complexities of recovering from them.
Exactly. So let's head to Steinhatchee, Florida, which, as you know, bore the brunt of Helene's fury. USA Today did some incredible reporting from the ground there, and honestly, some of the images are just heartbreaking.
And it's important to remember that for Steinhatchee, this isn't their first experience with this level of devastation.
Right.
They were hit by Hurricane Helene in 2016 and then again just last year by Idalia. So you have a community grappling not just with the immediate impact, but the cumulative effect of repeated trauma and loss.
The USA Today piece captures this really powerfully. One resident, Jamie Lee, said, "This is overwhelming. I don't think it's sunk in yet." And you can just hear the raw emotion in her voice. It's that sense of shock, of not even knowing where to begin to process the sheer scale of loss.
And I think what often gets overlooked in these situations is that while there's the physical rebuilding, there's also the emotional and mental rebuilding that has to happen. The stress, the anxiety, the uncertainty of the future, those are all very real consequences that we need to talk about.
Absolutely. And it's not just the emotional toll, it's the logistical nightmare that follows a storm like Helene's. The USA Today article shares the story of Pamela Keene, who walked out to find her yard transformed into what they called a seagrass buffet. Scattered food debris everywhere, even a whole tub of oysters just casually resting amongst the wreckage.
It's a stark reminder that the impact of a hurricane extends far beyond the initial wind and rain. For people like Pamela, it's suddenly having to navigate the logistics of insurance claims, finding temporary housing if their homes are uninhabitable, and figuring out how to put their lives back together, often with limited resources and support.
And tragically, these stories are being repeated thousands of times across the region. It's not just Steinhatchee. We've seen reports from ABC News about travel chaos caused by Helene, with almost 900 flights canceled, cruise itineraries completely upended, and major airports like Tampa International shutting down entirely.
Which for a state like Florida that relies so heavily on tourism has huge economic implications. The immediate costs of recovery are one thing, but then you factor in the long-term impact on businesses forced to close potentially for months, the lost revenue from tourism, and the ripple effects on industries that rely on those businesses. It's a devastating blow.
It's just wild how one storm can have such a ripple effect, but it really makes you think, why are these surges getting so much worse? Helene's surge was particularly devastating, and we have to talk about that. Is this the new normal that we need to brace ourselves for?
Yeah, that's the question a lot of people are asking, and for good reason. To understand Helene's impact, we need to really dig into how storm surge works.
Yeah.
And thankfully, that University of Florida study you shared breaks it down really well.
Okay, so storm surge basics. Give us the rundown. What makes it so dangerous?
Okay, so in the simplest terms, picture a bathtub.
Okay.
When you turn the faucet on full blast, the water level rises quickly. Right? Now imagine a hurricane's powerful winds pushing massive amounts of water towards the shore, like an enormous, relentless faucet. That's storm surge.
Okay.
Add to that the lower air pressure within the hurricane, which allows the sea level to rise even higher, and the shape of the coastline, which can funnel that surge like a ramp, and you have a recipe for a very, very dangerous situation.
So it's not just the water, but the way that the hurricane acts like this force multiplier, pushing it further inland with such incredible power.
Exactly. The National Hurricane Center reported surges of over 15 feet in some areas, hit by Helene. That's not just some flooding in the streets. We're talking a wall of water capable of wiping out entire structures.
Yeah.
And sadly, those low-lying areas like Steinhatchee, already hit hard by previous storms, are the most vulnerable to this kind of devastation.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And it makes you wonder, is this the kind of extreme weather event that we're going to see more of as our climate changes?
That's a big question, and the University of Florida study brings up some really significant findings in the scientific community. While research is ongoing, there's growing concern that warmer ocean temperatures are fueling more intense hurricanes. Think of it like this. Warmer water acts like high-octane fuel, potentially leading to rapid intensification of storms and, unfortunately, even more destructive storm surges.
So warmer water, angrier storms, and bigger surges. That's a worrying combination, especially for coastal communities already grappling with the aftermath of previous hurricanes. Speaking of what you mentioned earlier, the cumulative impact of these storms. Even if Helene had been a bit weaker, wouldn't the fact that Steinhatchee was hit by Adelia just last year make it that much harder to recover this time around?
Absolutely. That's a really critical point that often gets overlooked. The University of Florida study really emphasizes that it's not just about a single storm. It's about the cumulative effect of repeated hits.
Right.
When a community is slammed by hurricane after hurricane with barely any time to catch their breath, rebuild, and fortify, their resilience is chipped away. Each storm becomes a setback in an already uphill battle.
It's like trying to rebuild a sandcastle with the tide constantly coming in and washing away your progress before you can even get ahead. And then on top of the physical damage, there's the unseen toll on people's mental health. You've got millions without power, as Yahoo News reported days after Helene hit. The stress of displacement, financial uncertainty, and the constant fear of the next storm, it's a lot to bear.
You're right. It's a crisis that often unfolds silently and tragically long after the initial shock of the storm has passed. Imagine the mental and emotional weight of rebuilding your life only to have it ripped away again and again.
Yeah.
That trauma, the anxiety, the economic hardship, those are wounds that can take years to heal, affecting individuals, families, entire communities. It's something we need to pay much closer attention to because true recovery goes far beyond bricks and mortar.
And, on top of everything else, it's like the financial burden just adds this whole other layer of difficulty.
Yeah.
Yahoo News was saying that a lot of people don't even have flood insurance.
Yeah. It's a really big problem and a major gap in, how we prepare for these kinds of events.
Right.
Because, a lot of people, they have homeowners insurance.
Right.
But that doesn't actually usually cover flooding. So even people who think they're covered might end up having to pay a ton of money out of pocket after a storm like Helene. And then even for those who do have flood insurance, like you were saying, it can be such a pain to actually get the money.
Right.
With all the paperwork and the delays. It's like another layer of stress on top of an already impossible situation.
So it really is this perfect storm of more intense hurricanes hitting the same places over and over again, and people aren't properly insured, and then there's the mental health impact on top of that. Yeah. It feels like a lot to handle. So where do we even go from here?
Well, I think it starts with really understanding how complex this problem is, while also remembering how incredibly resilient these communities are. Like, we can't stop hurricanes from happening, but we can be smarter about how we get ready for them, how we react afterwards, and how we support the people who are hurting long after the news cameras are gone.
Yeah, it seems like the idea of resilience keeps coming up.
Yeah.
So thinking about that image of crabby dads from the USA Today article, the one where it's just the concrete steps left.
Yeah.
Can a place like Steinhatchee actually bounce back from this much damage again and again?
That's a really good question. And honestly, only Scott and the people in Steinhatchee can answer that for themselves. But what we do know is that those kinds of communities, they have this amazing ability to come together. They support their neighbors, they rebuild even when it seems impossible. There's just this deep well of resilience there, fueled by a sense of community and this need to hold on to their way of life.
It's like that detail from the USA Today article where they mentioned that there were still a few dollar bills stuck to what was left of the rafters at Krabby Dad's.
Right.
Almost like a little reminder of the life that bar used to have.
Yeah.
And knowing Scott Peters, I have a feeling he's going to look at those steps and see a foundation to rebuild on not just a pile of rubble.
Yeah, I think that's what it all comes down to. Resilience isn't about never getting knocked down. It's about having the strength to get back up and rebuild and adapt even when it feels impossible. And that's what's happening right now in Steinhatchee and in so many other communities affected by Helene.
And to everyone listening, especially those of you who are dealing with the aftermath of Helene right now, please know that you're not alone. If you need help finding resources, a good place to start is floridadisaster.org. We'll be sure to link it in the show notes.
And even if you weren't directly affected by the storm, remember that even just being aware and showing your support can make a huge difference. These aren't just stories about hurricanes. They're stories about people, about communities, and about the incredible strength of the human spirit.
So we'll leave you with this. The next time you hear about a hurricane in the news, don't just think about the category or the wind speeds. Think about Scott Peters. Think about Jamie Lee. Think about all those untold stories of the people impacted by the storm. That's what matters most, and that's where we need to focus our attention.